On the 12th day after my hip surgery, I woke to the sound of the blinds clicking closed and the careful, familiar shuffle of paperwork, not from a nurse, not from the physical therapist, but from my daughter. And I knew before I even opened my eyes that something was being signed that I hadn't asked for. I'm Helen Alvarez. I'm 71. And that was the moment. I knew my daughter no longer saw me as her mother but as an inconvenience with assets. Subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks. I wasn't even supposed to need surgery, but last fall, I tripped while trying to hang a wind chime I'd bought in Santa Fe, the little green one with the carved clay bird. My foot slipped off the second step of the porch stool, and I landed hard, so hard I heard something crack like a branch, under ice. I remember the neighbor's porch light flicking on, and the coldness in my fingertips. Even though it was still October, the doctors at St. Joseph's called it a clean break, a standard recovery, 6 to 8 weeks, they said. My daughter Clarissa had insisted I recover at her house. It's just easier, she'd said, with a firm smile that told me I didn't really have a say. And maybe I didn't argue because part of me thought, well, maybe this is the moment. Maybe she wants to take care of me now, like I once did. For her, she cleared out the guest room, brought in soft towels and her old electric kettle so I could have tea. I noticed the kettle still had the sticker on it, the one I'd given her 5 birthdays ago, still unused until I came. It should have felt comforting, but it didn't. It felt rehearsed. By the 3rd day, I had a routine. Breakfast on a tray at 9, medication at 10:30, ice packs at noon. But the meals were prepared by her husband, James. She barely stayed in the room longer than it took to ask, pain level, before stepping out again. Her eyes stayed on her phone. And when I spoke about the nurse, or the neighbor's get well card, or the way the leaves looked outside, she only nodded. On the 7th day, she took my phone, said I needed rest, said no distractions. I should have known. But it wasn't until that 12th morning, the blinds snapping closed, her voice low and tight, speaking to someone I couldn't see, that I understood what was actually happening. I opened my eyes just enough to see her hand signing something. It wasn't a birthday card. It wasn't my mail. It was a stack of documents, the kind printed on watermark paper. And beside her sat a man in glasses, flipping pages with latex fingers. I closed my eyes again. I listened, and I kept my breathing, slow and shallow like the doctor taught me, only this time, it wasn't for the pain in my hip. Later that day, when she left to run errands, I asked James for my phone back. He hesitated, said Clarissa wanted, but I didn't let him finish. I asked again. This time, he brought it, but not before I saw the small look of regret in his face. A decent man, maybe. Just not a brave one. I waited until the house was quiet. It took me a full 15 minutes to sit upright and another 5 to type the passcode correctly. My hands were shaking. There it was, an email from her, sent to her lawyer, with an attachment. Final version, Mom, will update. Final version. I clicked it open. She had named herself sole executor. She had cut my nephew, Evan, out entirely, the same boy I used to take to science fairs and school plays when his own parents couldn't. She'd added a clause about protecting familial assets, which was just a pretty way of saying, I'll decide what happens to her things, my house, my books, my garden tools, even my mother's wedding ring, one I never wore but always kept in the velvet pouch. Don't mention of me approving it. No mention of my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't throw the phone. I just stared at it until the screen went dark and my own face reflected back at me. Small, wrinkled eyes, tired but wide open now. I thought about my kitchen table back home, the one with the little chip in the corner from when Clarissa was 7 and banged her math book down in frustration. I thought about the sun that used to pour in through the east window each morning, warming my knuckles as I wrote grocery lists and paid bills. And I thought, this isn't recovery. This is a replacement. I was alive. And yet, somehow, she had already begun unmaking me. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who kept a mental ledger of sacrifices. It always felt petty, unbecoming. But now, in this soft, strange chapter of my life where the body heals slower than the heart, I find those memories rising like little stitches on an old scar. I remember the winter of '87. Clarissa was 7 and had the flu so bad I didn't sleep for 3 nights. I stayed up by her bedside with a cool washcloth and that ancient humidifier I borrowed from the neighbors. I called off work, burned through all my sick days. When the fever finally broke, she whispered, "Thank you," before falling back asleep. I still remember the weight of her tiny hand on mine. That memory used to warm me. Now it just hurts. And yet, that was just one of 1,000 things. I worked nights at the clinic for 15 years. Not because I loved the job, but because it meant I could be there in the mornings for drop-offs, forgotten homework, emergency field trip forms. I wore the same shoes until the soles thinned because she needed braces. I let go of a man who wanted to marry me because Clarissa said she didn't feel safe around him. She was only 11. He'd never done anything inappropriate, just loud. But I didn't hesitate. I chose her peace over my partnership. I always chose her. There's a ledger in that. Even when I couldn't afford much, I always made birthdays into magic. I'd tape balloons to the ceiling while she slept. I'd make French toast with cinnamon just the way she liked it. I remember once driving across town to pick up a rare art kit she'd begged for and finding out it was sold out. I ended up buying separate pieces and building the whole set myself from scratch. She never knew. She just smiled and said, "You always get it right, Mom." And maybe that's what stayed with me, that she used to know, used to see. Later, when she went off to college and came back quieter, more careful with her words, I figured it was just age. She'd changed, of course. We all do. But I still sent care packages. I still helped her with rent the first year when she was in between jobs. When she and James got married, I offered to cover the venue. She declined, saying they wanted something low-key, intimate. I didn't realize until later that it was also a way of keeping my guest list small, just a few tables, and only one for Helen. No Mom on the card. Still, I smiled through it, toasted to them. I wore the deep blue dress she liked on me, gave them the pearl earrings I'd inherited from my own mother. I didn't need much, just a seat at the table. But even that, I see now, was conditional. There's something about being needed that makes a person feel secure in love. But once the needing ends, you find yourself slowly edged out of the room, not by force, just by omission. I was there when Clarissa had both of her children. I held her hand through 30 hours of labor with her first, and slept upright on the waiting room couch during her second pace. I stocked their freezer with casseroles, cleaned the baseboards, and walked the dog in the rain. I became the woman who just quietly made things run, and I suppose I didn't notice. Back then, how often my name disappeared from stories. How many times someone would ask, "How did you manage all this?" And Clarissa would just smile and say, "We figured it out." We. I was the ghost in the we. There were other things too. Small but sharp. The Mother's Days, where she posted about her mother-in-law, and not me. The time she asked me not to wear my usual scent, said it reminded the kids of something old. The way she started calling me Helen in front of her friends, like Mom was too sentimental or messy or inconvenient. But I let it pass, you see. I was raised to believe that love was best shown in constancy, that it didn't matter if it went unnoticed. What mattered was that it was given, poured, held. So I kept showing up, kept bringing pies to Thanksgiving, even when I was told not to fuss, kept sending birthday cards, even when they went unacknowledged, kept knitting scarves each Christmas, even though last year I found 2 of them still in their plastic bags, unopened. In the back of the hall closet. They didn't see me stop giving, but I did. Not all at once, just little things. I stopped writing notes in the cards, just signed my name. I stopped asking to host Christmas Eve, said I'd come to whatever they planned. I stopped offering to babysit unless asked. And still, the distance grew. I wonder now if they noticed, or if the slow retreat of a mother's love is too quiet for busy people to hear. I think in some ways, Clarissa assumed I'd always be there, that my presence was as permanent and predictable as an old tree in the yard, something you pass without thinking, but still expect to see every morning. But trees fall too. I remember the first time I caught her going through my drawer in the guest room. She said she was looking for lotion, but the drawer held only bank statements and old letters. I said nothing, just nodded. The next day, the drawer was locked. That was 6 months before the surgery, long before the papers. Now, here I am, lying in her house, eating her meals, feeling like a guest in a life I once built. And the question that haunts me most isn't why did she do it? It's when did I become disposable? Because I gave everything I had, and somewhere in the middle of all that giving I disappeared. But not forever. No, something else is beginning now. It's quiet, just like me. And they won't hear it until it's already moving. It doesn't happen all at once, the falling away. If it did, I think I would have noticed, bought it, named it for what it was. But slow forgetting is harder to see. It wears no colors. It doesn't shout. It just fades. I began to feel it in moments I can only now recognize in hindsight. 100 quiet hurts, each one small enough to excuse. But added together, they built something heavy. It was Clarissa forgetting to call on the anniversary of my mother's death. That might seem like a small thing, but when you're the only one who still lights a candle, the forgetting becomes louder than any silence. Then it was the holidays. It started with Thanksgiving. She said they were going to James' parents this time just for that year. I understood. I said, of course. I roasted a small chicken instead of a turkey, sat alone at my kitchen table, and told myself it was just a shift, not a sign. Then it was Christmas. She said the kids wanted to stay home, open presents in their own beds. A new tradition. I didn't want to be the woman who clung, so I mailed the gifts early. Watched a movie. I fell asleep before midnight, but then birthdays started slipping. My own, first. One year, I got a text. Just for words. Happy birthday, love you. No call, no card, no visit. I told myself they were busy. That love isn't measured in phone calls. But something inside me flinched. That little inner part of me that once wore perfume and made upside-down pineapple cake, just for the fun of it, felt a little more distant, a little more erased. I kept going, of course. I always kept going. But that year I didn't bake anything. Then came the assumptions. Clarissa would tell me how I should change my house, sell it, move closer to them, and get rid of the old stuff. I remember her calling my bookshelf clutter, the same shelf she used to reach up to, pulling down storybooks with applesauce on her fingers. She suggested assisted living once, not meanly, not directly, just floated the idea, just in case something happens. I told her nothing was happening, that I was fine. I was still driving then, still gardening. I still teach piano to 2 neighborhood girls once a week. But I could see it in her eyes. She didn't really believe me. That's when I noticed the tilt, not in her love, but in her respect. She stopped asking what I thought, stopped including me in decisions that affected me. When she booked our family beach rental one summer, she told me afterward, just assumed I was free, didn't ask if I wanted to go. And when I said I might not, she raised an eyebrow and said, "You always say yes." Maybe that's the problem, I thought. Maybe I always have. There were other things, too. The little embarrassments. Like when she introduced me to her friends as Helen, not my mom, or when she laughed at the way I still used a paper calendar. When she rolled her eyes after I confused the smart remote. When she told me, gently but with that same clipped tone, that I should let the kids figure things out on their own. After I offered advice, I began to feel like a relic, a creature out of time. Useful, maybe, but not cherished. Present, but not seen. And yet I stayed polite, stayed kind, because I didn't want to make trouble, didn't want to become that old woman people speak of in sighs and sideways glances. Instead, I made myself small. I trimmed my words. I smiled at the right moments. I brought gifts to every gathering. I took photos but never asked for copies. I gave without asking for a return. And I told myself, this is what mothers do. But even mothers break. I remember the sting of her skipping my friend Janet's funeral. Janet had been like a sister to me. For 20 years, Clarissa knew her well. They'd shared holidays. Janet held her at my second divorce like she was her own. And yet Clarissa said she couldn't get away that day. She sent flowers. I never told her what that absence cost me. I just said thank you, and cried in my car after the service, alone. By then, I'd stopped offering rides, stopped asking to join things, stopped suggesting ideas. I knew they'd be gently declined or ignored. I didn't have the energy to smile through another "oh, we already made plans." And so I started talking to myself more, out loud, sometimes, in the kitchen while chopping onions, in the garden, watering the tomatoes. I'd narrate the day, comment on the birds, pretend someone was listening. That was the cruelest hurt. Maybe not forgetting, but the loss of witness. Because when no one sees you, or really sees you start to disappear, even from your own memory, you begin to question if you were ever truly essential or just convenient. And yet, I didn't rage, I didn't confront, I didn't accuse. That's not who I am. But I watched. I watched her step in front of me in conversations, watched her sigh when I asked questions, watched her eyes drift toward her phone when I spoke longer than a few seconds, and each time, A little more of me turned inward. Not bitterly, just privately. People assume heartbreak is loud, but mine was quiet. It happened in kitchens, in waiting rooms, in group texts I was never added to. It happened in missed moments, in assumptions, in the slow erasure of tenderness. They never hit me, they just stopped holding me. And that's when I began to understand something no one ever told me. You don't have to be abused to be discarded. Don't have to be hated to be erased. Sometimes love just forgets how to see you. And when it does, you can either shrink into it or step away from it. I wasn't ready to step away. Not yet. But I had started measuring my distance, and soon, the final line would come, not with shouting, but with ink. It wasn't the first betrayal that broke me. It was the last one. The one they didn't even think I'd notice. I used to think of myself as the kind of woman who couldn't be surprised anymore. After you've raised a child, buried a parent, stood in courtrooms next to men you once said vows to, you start to believe you've seen the full stretch of human behavior. But it turns out betrayal doesn't need to be violent or loud to be devastating. Sometimes, all it takes is a pen and a moment when your body can't get out of bed to stop it. The surgery had gone well, or so they said. I don't remember most of the first few days. There were moments, the clinking of a nurse's badge, the sour taste of applesauce with crushed pills, the soft pressure of compression cuffs around my calves. I was floating in a slow fog, grateful for help, for warmth, for what I thought was care. Clarissa had said I'd recover best at her home, more peaceful, she said, and I agreed, not because I trusted her but because I needed to. At that point, I still wanted to believe in the story I'd told myself for years, that beneath all the changes and coldness, she still loved me enough to protect me. What I didn't expect was how quickly she turned caretaking into control. She took my phone on the second day, said I should rest without distractions. I didn't fight it. I was tired, aching. I assumed it would only be for a night. Then she moved my bag aid. It was in the way. I didn't ask where. I just let it happen. Small things, manageable things, until one morning I woke up and couldn't find my wedding ring. That had never left my hand in decades, not even after the divorce. I kept it not out of sentiment for the marriage, but for what it represented those years. I built something, kept something, gave everything. It was mine. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off. You must have taken it off for the surgery. It's probably with your things. I nodded, but something in her voice didn't sit right, so I waited, watched. She thought I was too groggy to notice, too weak to care, but by day 10, the fog had lifted, and I began to see clearly how she spoke to her husband in hushed tones near my doorway, how the house grew quiet when I entered the room, how my own signature had been printed neatly on a stack of papers that had never once passed my eyes. When I finally got my phone back after asking 3 times in 3 different tones, I found the email, sent from her account to a legal office I didn't recognize. Subject line, revised will, final copy. It took everything in me to open the attachment. My hands trembled, but not from the surgery. There it was, in dry legal language. I, Helen Alvarez, declared this to be my final will and testament, dated just a week prior when I had been barely able to sit upright without assistance. It was named Clarissa sole executor. It reassigned assets, sold my house, sold my home of 40 years, the house I had planted tulips around every spring, the house with the loose stair that always squeaked at night, the one place left that had my fingerprints on every wall, sold. She hadn't forged my nominat exactly. It was a power of attorney I'd signed months earlier, back when she said it was just in case something ever happened. Back when I still trusted her. That paper had allowed her to move everything, to sign for me, to silence me. I stared at the screen, the dull blue glow reflecting against my blankets, and for a long time I didn't move. The 4 machine beeped in rhythm. Outside, I could hear wind against the siding. Inside, nothing made sense anymore. That afternoon, I asked to be taken back to my own house, just to check on things. Clarissa hesitated, said it wasn't a good time, said I needed rest. I said I'd feel better seeing my garden. I said it softly, not with anger, just finality. She took me, reluctantly. I sat in the passenger seat in silence, my hands tucked beneath the thin blanket I brought with me. When we pulled into the driveway, something felt off. The curtains were gone. The porch was empty. The mailbox had a new lock. And then I saw it. A realtor's sign, not for sale. Sold. I asked her. When she said, it's complicated. "We'll talk later." Later never came. I asked for the key. She said the new owners were finalizing paperwork. I asked why I wasn't told. She said she didn't want me to stress during recovery. I asked where my things were. She said they were in storage. That was the moment, not the email, not the missing ring, not the forged decisions. It was when she said storage that I felt the break, because she had taken a life, built in full-color books, my linens, my photo albums, my teacups, and packed them into brown boxes behind a padlocked garage door. I would never see. She had put my life away, neatly, quietly, like clutter. And that's when I knew this wasn't love, misguided. This was convenience, stressed in concern. This was calculation, not care. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I asked her to take me back. And in the silence of that ride, something inside me shifted. I realized that when someone crosses a line like that, they don't just betray your trust, they erase your place in the story. And I was done being written out. I returned to her house, not as a guest, but as a witness. I took inventory not just of my belongings, but of my strength. I made notes. I wrote dates. I began to collect proof, not to confront, but to protect what little I had left. I stopped asking questions. I stopped explaining myself. And I started to plan. The final line had been crossed. And now, everything that came next would belong to me. Not out of vengeance, but out of clarity. There is a kind of silence that isn't passive. One that doesn't come from defeat or confusion, but from something sharper, something that arrives when you finally understand, and without the illusion that no one is coming to apologize. That's the silence I chose. It began that same evening. After the visit to my house turned someone else's, Clarissa tried to explain, on the drive back, filling the air with phrases like, "We can talk about it more later," and "it was for the best." But I didn't respond. I watched the side of the road and counted power lines. I watched the clouds move low and fast like they had somewhere better to be. When we returned, she helped me up the steps like nothing had happened. But something had. She just couldn't feel it. That's the difference between the one who breaks the vase and the one who has to pick up the pieces. Only one walks away, with blood on their hands. I stopped speaking that night, not completely, not dramatically. I answered what I needed to, nodded where it was polite. But the woman who once filled rooms with warmth, the one who asked about homework and remembered birthdays and hummed while slicing apples, she sat down and folded her hands. I began to listen more than I ever had. I listened to the way Clarissa said my name like it was a task. I listened to the shuffle of papers behind closed doors. I listened to the silence that followed when I left the room. There's a power in silence. It makes people uncomfortable. It fills the spaces where explanations used to live. And without noise, the truth starts to echo louder than anything you could ever say. In those quiet days, I started writing again. Nothing fancy, just in an old spiral notebook I'd tucked into the bottom of my suitcase. I wrote down names, dates, questions I would later ask not out loud, but of lawyers, of records, of myself. I wrote down the date of my surgery, the day I saw the will, the day I saw the sold sign. I wrote down every time Clarissa left the house with her laptop and returned, looking distracted. I began to document, not like a daughter, but like a witness. I also started noticing what was missing. My photo albums had vanished. She told me they were in storage, but couldn't say where. My letters from my sister, who passed 10 years ago, were nowhere to be found. My jewelry, small, old pieces I never wore, but kept in the cedar box in my bedroom, were now packed away safely, she said. I knew better than to ask twice. People lie less when you stop giving them room to elaborate. I asked James, once, about the will. Just one question. "Did you know?" He froze, just for a second. Then I looked down and said, "She thought it was the safest option." I nodded. I never asked again. James began avoiding me after that. Not rudely, just a little more space in his voice, a little more distance in his footsteps. It was like watching someone slide away from shore, unsure if they're fleeing danger or guilt. The days blurred. My recovery improved. I took my first steps without a walker. I began stretching alone in the mornings. Clarissa praised my progress like I was a child who had made an honor roll. I just smiled, quietly, and when she asked how I was feeling, I said, stronger. It was the truth. I began making calls once I could sit for longer than 10 minutes, without pain. I used the house phone, an old one they'd tucked in a drawer in the hallway. She didn't know I'd found it. She thought I was still off the grid, still in her care. But I called Evan, my nephew, the one she'd erased from the will. He picked up immediately. He said, "Aunt Helen," like he hadn't said it in years, and maybe he hadn't. I told him I was all right, that I just had some questions. He said he'd help however he could. That's the thing about the ones you quietly cared for when they were young. Some of them remember. He gave me the number of an attorney, a quiet woman named Lena, who didn't speak in pity but in fact. I told her I wasn't sure what I wanted, yet just to understand what had been done and what could be undone. She said, "You have more power than you think." That stayed with me. I didn't tell Clarissa about the meetings. I didn't need to. I just kept healing, quietly, strongly. And when she asked what I wanted to do when I was better, I said I wasn't sure yet. She said she thought I might want to stay a while. Maybe she could set up something more permanent. A room, a plan. I said nothing, because I had already made my own. I started sorting what I had left. My bank accounts, my pension, the one safety deposit box she didn't know about. I began rewriting my will not out of vengeance, but restoration. I wrote my own name at the top. I included people who had shown up when they didn't have to. I left out those who had simply stood close but never stood by. I listed everything in plain, human terms, not as a ledger of punishment, but as a map of who had remained when the ground gave way beneath me. I gave myself permission to change everything, and I did. By the time I could walk without the cane, I had a folder full of plans, accounts, contacts. My silence had made room for something I hadn't felt in years. Certainty. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. I had simply stopped asking for someone else to give me dignity. I had gone out and reclaimed it myself. Let me know when you're ready for section 6. I moved differently after that. The first time I walked to the end of the driveway without a cane. No one was watching. There was no applause, no proud daughter waiting with a camera, no warm hand on my shoulder to say, "You did it." Just the sound of gravel beneath my shoes and the faint hum of wind through the bare trees. It was early March, and the air still had that cold edge that stung the nose and cleared the lungs, but it woke me, woke something old and buried. I stood there at the edge of the driveway for a long time, staring out at the empty road, and I felt it was not joy, not triumph, just readiness. That was the last week I stayed in Clarissa's house. I didn't announce my plans. There was no confrontation, no argument. She thought I'd stay a few more weeks, maybe longer. She was already talking about adjusting the guest room and getting someone to come by for physical therapy sessions. I smiled politely, said I was grateful, thanked her for everything, and then, the next morning, I arranged a ride. A woman, named Barbara, who I'd met years ago at church, pulled up in an old sedan with the back seat lined in clean blankets and magazines tucked into the pockets behind the front seats. She didn't ask many questions, just gave me a soft smile and helped me settle in. Clarissa wasn't home when I left. That was on purpose. I left a note, short, neat. "Thank you for your care. I'm feeling strong enough now to be on my own. I've made arrangements. Please don't worry." I didn't sign it with love, just my name. I moved into a small, one-bedroom rental near the outskirts of town. Nothing special. A place with peeling paint on the windowsills and a draft under the back door. But it was mine. There was a little kitchen with old yellow tiles and a balcony that overlooked a maple tree. I could hear birds in the morning and the occasional dog barking 2 houses over. Silence, the kind I chose. At first, it was just about breathing, waking on my own terms, making tea in my own cup, folding towels the way I liked them. I'd forgotten how peaceful it could feel to simply belong in your own space, not to feel like a guest in your own life. I unpacked slowly. From the small boxers I'd managed to reclaim books, an Afghan, a few framed photos that hadn't disappeared into storage limbo. I started rebuilding, not a home, but a rhythm. And in that rhythm, I found something else. I found courage. I scheduled regular meetings with Lena, the attorney. She was calm, deliberate, the kind of woman who didn't blink at buried clauses or missing forms. She taught me the language of the paper world. We sat together at a round table, and she showed me how to unpick the knots Clarissa had tied. One string at a time, we reopened the estate. We froze the house sale under a clause Clarissa had overlooked. We issued notices, filed statements, re-established my agency over the accounts tied to my name. Nothing vengeful, nothing public. just firm steps in the direction of reclamation. I'd never felt powerful in a courtroom, but when I signed the motion to void the will she'd updated behind my back, I felt steady. It wasn't about punishment. It was about telling the world, in writing, that I was still here. I started walking more after that, down to the corner cafe with the cracked leather booths. I'd order the same thing, black coffee and one scrambled egg. The waitress, a young woman named Josie, started to learn my name. She'd bring my coffee just how I liked it, with the sleeve wrapped tight and the spoon tucked underneath. It felt good, being known, even in small ways. One afternoon, I found myself at the library, something I hadn't done in years. I walked the aisles without needing anything. No errands, no obligations. I pulled down a book of poems by accident and read one about forgiveness that made me cry quietly in the corner chair. The librarian walked past and offered me a tissue without saying a word. Little kindnesses, they began to fill the spaces that had once been crowded with doubt. I met with Evan again, to my nephew. We sat in a small diner and talked about his job, his partner, the dog they'd rescued. He apologized for the distance and said he didn't know what was happening. I believed him. We didn't talk much about Clarissa, not yet, but when he stood to leave, he hugged me longer than I expected. It felt like a bridge being built, one stone at a time. Back at home, I began journaling again, not just dates and facts, but thoughts. Small truths I hadn't had room for. I wrote about how my silence had been misunderstood, how strength sometimes looks like stepping away rather than standing in place. I wrote about grief, not for what had been done, but for what had been lost quietly along the way. And I wrote about change, because something had changed, not the past, not Clarissa.me, that I no longer waited for calls that didn't come. I no longer sent gifts that went unopened. I no longer asked to be included in spaces that had made me small. I had moved differently. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but in certainty, the kind that doesn't need to be declared. The kind you feel in your spine when you close a door behind you and finally hear what quiet sounds like, a choice. I never told them I was gone, not really. There was no farewell dinner, no closing conversation, no final attempt to be heard. I slipped out of their world the same way I had existed in it those last few years, quietly, respectfully, as if my presence had always been optional. But the absence came with a weight, not for me. For them, at first, I imagined they thought it was temporary, that I'd call, maybe after a few weeks, say I missed the kids, and ask about the family vacation I hadn't been invited to in years. Maybe they expected a holiday card, or a birthday reminder, or a gentle little check-in to let them know I was still in orbit. But the card never came, the calls never rang, and slowly, I began to hear about what I had left behind, not from them, but from the places in between, from neighbors, from Evan, from the space that forms when a role goes unfilled. They didn't notice the rhythm of me, until it was no longer keeping time for them. Clarissa had to call the bank herself when a discrepancy showed up in one of the frozen accounts. She wasn't used to having to explain things. I had always been the buffer, the one who made sure forms were filled, accounts stayed clean, fees stayed waived. But now, her name alone didn't carry the same weight. She wasn't my proxy anymore. She was just Clarissa. James reached out once, a short message left on a voicemail I never returned. Just wanted to check in. Hope you're doing okay. I think that was guilt talking. Or maybe uncertainty. Maybe they didn't expect me to hold the line. They had been counting on my return. I suppose they thought motherhood was a contract you couldn't break. But I hadn't broken anything. I had simply stopped renewing it. And it showed. There were birthdays missed, now mine. Yes, but there's two. The handmade cards that used to show up at their door with little drawings and crisp $20 bills tucked inside, gone. The texts that used to come at midnight with song lyrics or book recommendations, or photos of the sunrise that had once come from me, not anymore. The kids, my grandchildren, didn't call. I hadn't expected them to. They were still young, still under the influence of whatever version of the story Clarissa had spun. That I was tired, that I needed space, that I was resting. That let them believe it. They don't know yet what it feels like to be rewritten, but they will, because the thing about absence is that it echoes. At first, it's quiet, a missed casserole at the family potluck, a birthday forgotten that used to be remembered, a soft space where laughter used to be. Then the echo grows louder, when tax season rolls around and no one knows which folder holds what, when the children ask where grandma is, when the holidays feel colder, and no one knows why. I had been the silent scaffolding, the unseen keeper of order, of tradition, of memory. And now, they had to live in the house they built without it. I heard from Janet's daughter that she still sends me postcards sometimes. She told me Clarissa had asked around for an estate planner, said she seemed flustered, disorganized, confused when things weren't as simple as she'd expected. I smiled at that, not out of cruelty, but clarity. Life isn't simple when you dismantle the people who kept it steady. My old friends reached out to, some had believed Clarissa when she said I was taking time for myself, but when months passed without my usual letters, my calls, my place at the church bake sale, they started to wonder. I met with a few of them at a small coffee shop one morning, and explained, quietly, that I was all right, not happy, not heartbroken, just awake. And when I told them what had happened, not in detail, just the truth, they didn't gasp or scold or shake their heads. They just nodded, because some of them had children too, and some of them were waiting for the same kind of break. Clarissa, I imagine, began to feel it most when decisions had to be made. I was no longer there to babysit, to pick up last-minute groceries, to loan a car, to fill the silence in a busy house. I was no longer the Sunday cushion, no longer the bridge between hard days and soft places. I had been erased, and in my absence they found what I had carried, not just the errands, but the grace, the unconditional space, the witness, and without it, they were exposed, not to the world, but to themselves. I'm sure she told others I had grown distant. That age had made me cold, or confused, or forgetful. But the people who knew me, the real me, knew better. They saw it in the way I stood straighter now, in the steadiness of my words, in the quiet pride I carried like a shawl. I was not confused. I had simply chosen. There is power in letting go of people who do not choose you back. There is dignity in silence, when noise only makes you smaller, and there is peace in knowing that what they lost was never loud. To begin with, it was the hum of devotion, the quiet miracle of someone who shows up over and over and over, without applause, without demand, without fail, until one day, she doesn't. I didn't write the letter out of anger. I didn't even write it for her. I wrote it for the part of me that still needed to say goodbye. It was a Sunday morning, the kind that arrives quiet and slow, when the world hasn't quite decided what kind of day it wants to be. I'd just poured my teachable, the kind that settles the heart, and I stood by the window, watching the wind move through the branches of the maple tree outside my little rental. Light filtered in like a soft breath. I sat down, opened the drawer, and pulled out the envelope I'd been ignoring for weeks. Plain, off-white, her name written in my hand. Clarissa. I had started it many times. Crumpled versions filled the wastebasket. One had been too cold. Another is too sad. One I tore in half because it felt like I was still trying to convince her of something, and I was done convincing anyone of my worth. But that morning, I felt still enough to begin again. And this time, I wrote without needing anything in return. No apology. No change. No redemption. Just the truth. I told her I remembered her laugh as a child. How she used to tilt her head all the way back, uninhibited, wild with joy. I told her about the day she first read on her own, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a tattered copy of Charlotte's Web. How her lips moved softly as she turned the pages, and I'd sat nearby, pretending not to watch. I wrote about how proud I had been quietly, constantly throughout every stage of her life, even the hard ones, even when we drifted, even when she closed doors and called it boundaries. I reminded her that motherhood, at least for me, was not a title I wore. It was a vow I lived. It wasn't always joyful. It wasn't always fair. But it was always whole. I acknowledged that I had made mistakes, that I'd said too little or too much, that I had clung when I should have let go, and let go when I should have held tighter. But I had never withheld love, not once. Then, I wrote the part I had never said aloud, that the deepest wound was not the changed will or the sold house. It was the moment I realized I had been managing her feelings for decades, bending myself so she would never feel guilt, dimming my pain so she could shine brighter, explaining myself over and over just to be given a chair at the table I built. And how somewhere in all that managing, I'd lost the fullness of my own voice. So I told her gently, but clearly, that I wasn't angry anymore. But I was done explaining, that I hoped she would someday understand what I gave, not just in acts, but in silence. The things I didn't say, the hurt I absorbed, the way I showed up even after the door was halfway closed. I ended the letter with this line: I will always carry the part of you that was innocent, but I have returned the version that forgot me. I folded it once, slipped it into the envelope, and then I lit a match. Not out of spite, not for drama, but because I needed to watch it go. I stood by the sink and held it gently as the flame climbed the edge. Turning her name to smoke, I watched the paper curl inward, as if the letter were folding into itself, releasing what was never going to be said between us. When the last corner blackened and fluttered into the porcelain basin, I turned on the water. The ashes slipped away, without a sound. That afternoon, I went walking, not far, just down the street to the little park with the crooked bench. I sat there a while, watching a young couple push a stroller. The baby was wrapped in a soft blue blanket, eyes wide to the world, and I smiled. Not because I wanted to start over, but because I had finally stopped needing to. I'd spent so long holding on to the version of myself that revolved around other people's needs, so long trying to preserve love like it was something fragile, like it would disappear if I didn't protect it from itself. But love isn't meant to be stored like glass, it's meant to move, and if it doesn't move with you, it wasn't yours to begin with. Later that week, I started a new journal, not the old spiral one filled with dates and pain and facts. This one was for stories, memories I didn't want to lose. I wrote about the first time I learned to ride a bike. I wrote about the time my mother taught me how to make lentil soup and we spilled the whole bag of carrots and laughed until our sides hurt. I wrote about a bus ride I took to the coast when I was 19 and the way the air smelled like salt and newness. None of it had anything to do with Clarissa. And that, somehow, was the healing dot, because forgiveness doesn't always look like a reunion. Sometimes it looks like expansion, making room inside yourself for the life that exists beyond the wound. That letter, those words I'd never speak aloud, became the bridge between who I had been and who I was finally becoming. Not a mother, not a wife, not a caretaker, not a forgotten woman waiting on a phone that wouldn't ring. Just me. Fully. Quietly. Here. My days begin with stillness now, not the kind born from absence or ache, but from presence, from the simplicity of being where I choose, on my own terms, with no one pulling at the corners of me. Most mornings, I rise before the sun. The world hasn't quite opened its eyes yet, and everything feels soft. I wrap the old knitted shawl around my shoulders, blue and ivory, made by my mother before Clarissa was born, and I make my way to the small kitchen. The kettle hums low as it heats, and I fill a ceramic mug that fits perfectly in my palms. No rush here. No one is waiting for me to fill their schedule or soften their bad moods. No invisible list of tasks only I know how to do. I sit by the window, just as the first blush of morning paints the buildings across the way, and I breathe in the silence I once feared. It's not lonely. Not anymore. It's mine. The maple tree outside has turned the color of burnt copper. Leaves gather along the walkway and swirl when the wind decides to remind me it's still alive. I've started sweeping them myself, not out of duty, but because I like the rhythm of it. Back and forth. A slow conversation with the season. The small rental I moved into has become home in ways the old house never quite was in the end. It's not filled with expensive furniture or curated photos, but every item here was chosen. Nothing here arrived by obligation. Even the chipped bowls on the shelf have their own quiet stories now. I found them at a garage sale 2 towns over, with a woman who reminded me of myself. We talked about nothing in particular for nearly an hour. That bowl, with its faded red rim, holds more warmth than any polished china ever did. I keep a journal by the bedside. I write 1 sentence every night before I sleep. Sometimes it's a memory. Sometimes a word I heard stuck in my ribs. Sometimes just the truth of the day. Today, I laughed. Today, I didn't miss her. Today, I watched a sparrow drink from the gutter, and it felt like grace. I don't reread them, not yet, but I will. Someday, maybe, when I'm old in a different way. Once a week, I go to the small community garden near the church. It's not well known, which is part of the charm. There, I tend to a narrow plot I was lucky enough to get last spring. I grow thyme, marigolds, and crooked carrots. I've learned to love the dirt under my fingernails and the ache in my knees. Something about tending to living things that ask for nothing but water and time, feels like its own kind of prayer. I've also started volunteering at the library. Just 2 afternoons a week, filing returns, helping the older patrons use the computer, sitting in on children's story hour. I don't do it for distraction. I do it because it reminds me that I am still useful, still good, still capable of offering something that doesn't ask to be paid back. Evan visits sometimes. He drives up on Sundays with pastries and stories. We don't talk about Clarissa, not directly. We talk around her about family, about choices, about the cost of silence. I know he still loves her. So do I, in my own way. But love, I've learned, can live in a place that no longer requires closeness. I've stopped checking for messages that never arrive. I don't scroll through old photos. I don't wait for holidays to mean what they used to. Somewhere along the way, I gave myself permission to redefine everything. I still pass mothers and daughters in cafes, holding hands, laughing about silly things. I won't lie, it stings sometimes. There's a part of me that wonders what kind of woman Clarissa became when she stopped needing me. And if there's a part of her that wonders who I became when I stopped waiting. But I don't linger there long, because now, my life is full in the way that truly matters. Not with things, not with company, but with soul, with slowness, with days that belong entirely to me. And that, after everything, is enough. There was a time I would have done anything for an invitation back into her life. A time when I would have folded myself into smaller and smaller shapes, just to be let in. But that time is over now. I let the light in through my own windows. Now, I let the garden grow however it pleases. Now, I spend more time speaking kindly to myself than waiting to be spoken to kindly by others. I was never asking for much, only to be seen, to be included in the life I helped shape, to be honored, not managed, remembered, not rearranged. And while I never got that from her, I did get something better in the end. I have mornings that don't begin with anxiety. I have evenings that end with peace. I got a version of life that doesn't hinge on being needed but on simply being. I walk to the market now with a cloth bag and a short list. I greet the woman who sells flowers on the corner. She always slips in an extra sprig of eucalyptus. Smell calm, she tells me. I smile. I return home, and I sit with myself. I wasn't angry. I was finally empty, and that was beautiful.